The first thing anyone noticed wasn't the lawyer's polished shoes or the leather briefcase. It was the way a 6-year-old girl threw herself between her father and the stranger standing on their tiny front porch, clutching her father's hand as though she believed another piece of bad news had finally come to take the last thing they still owned. The man quietly removed an envelope embossed with the seal of one of the country's largest corporations and spoke only a single sentence that turned an ordinary Thursday morning into the beginning of a miracle no one on that street would ever forget. 3 weeks earlier, that same father had given away the only couch in his home to a homeless stranger with nowhere to sleep. Everyone in Maple Ridge knew that Rowan Mercer had already lost more than most people could survive. At 38, he had buried his wife after a long illness, emptied every dollar of his savings on medical bills, sold nearly everything he owned except a battered pickup truck, and worked 2 jobs just to keep a tiny rental house over his and his daughter Clara's heads. Life had become a careful balance of hope and exhaustion. Every morning before sunrise, Rowan packed lunches, braided Clara's hair with clumsy fingers that improved a little each week, and reminded himself that every sacrifice was worth seeing her smile before school. Their home was small enough that every room could be seen from the hallway, but it was always spotless, filled with sunlight through clean windows, second-hand furniture, and photographs that reminded them love had once lived there in abundance. Rowan had developed a quiet habit after his wife's passing. Whenever he passed someone who looked forgotten, he stopped. Sometimes he offered a sandwich. Sometimes a bottle of water. Sometimes only a few minutes of conversation. He often said to himself that loneliness could be heavier than hunger. Clara watched everything her father did, and although she was still young, she was learning that kindness rarely announced itself with grand gestures. More often it appeared in ordinary moments when nobody else was paying attention. 3 weeks before the lawyer appeared, Rowan was driving home in broad daylight after finishing an early maintenance shift at a local elementary school. Rain clouds threatened but never opened. Near a bus stop, he noticed an older man sitting alone with a small duffel bag and a worn coat despite the mild weather. Most people hurried past him. Rowan almost continued driving. He was tired, behind on rent, and still had groceries to buy with money he barely possessed. Yet something about the man's expression stopped him. It wasn't desperation. It was dignity fighting to survive humiliation. Rowan parked the truck. The stranger introduced himself simply as Everett Sloan. He explained that the shelter downtown had reached capacity after unexpected repairs forced part of the building to close. Every motel nearby required identification he could not immediately produce because his wallet had been stolen days earlier. He insisted he wasn't asking for money. He only hoped to find a dry place to rest for one day until he could sort things out. Rowan hesitated. Inviting a stranger home contradicted every warning common sense could offer. He thought of Clara. He thought of responsibility. But he also remembered sleeping in a hospital chair for weeks beside his wife and how one volunteer had once offered him nothing more than coffee and a blanket. That simple kindness had carried him through one impossible afternoon. He invited Everett home. The tiny house suddenly seemed even smaller. Rowan apologized that they had only one bedroom, explaining that Clara slept there while he usually rested on the old living room couch. Everett immediately refused to inconvenience anyone. Rowan insisted. He carried a blanket into Clara's room and quietly made himself a place on the floor while Everett accepted the couch with visible embarrassment. Clara surprised everyone. Instead of fear, she offered Everett one of her favorite crayons and a sheet of paper, explaining that guests should never feel lonely. Everett spent the afternoon sketching birds so beautifully that Clara covered the refrigerator door with them before sunset. Rowan had not seen his daughter laugh so freely in months. Everett stayed only one night. The next morning, he cleaned the kitchen before Rowan awoke, repaired a loose cabinet hinge without being asked, folded every blanket, thanked Rowan with sincere gratitude, and left behind a handwritten note saying that true wealth was measured by the courage to trust another human being. Rowan smiled, folded the note into his wallet, and assumed he would never see the man again. Life returned to its familiar rhythm. Bills continued arriving. The school announced budget cuts, reducing Rowan's maintenance hours. His pickup developed engine trouble. Clara accidentally overheard him calculating expenses and quietly offered the contents of her piggy bank. believing coins could solve adult problems. Rowan hugged her so tightly that she wondered why he suddenly started crying. 3 weeks later, on another bright morning filled with warm sunshine, a black sedan stopped outside their modest home. Neighbors peeked through curtains. A sharply dressed lawyer stepped onto the porch carrying the same leather briefcase that now seemed strangely out of place among children's bicycles and flower pots. Rowan expected another debt collector. Instead, the lawyer politely introduced himself as Graham Whitmore, legal counsel for Hawthorne Industries, a multinational company known across the country for manufacturing advanced medical equipment and renewable energy technology. Rowan assumed there had been a mistake. He had never spoken to anyone connected with such an enormous corporation. Graham asked one unexpected question: had Rowan Mercer recently offered shelter to a gentleman named Everett Sloane? Rowan answered honestly. The lawyer smiled for the first time that he explained that Everett Sloane had spent decades building Hawthorne Industries alongside his closest friend before quietly retiring years earlier. Unlike his former business partner, Everett had withdrawn from public life after losing his wife and had devoted much of his fortune anonymously to charitable causes. Recently he had chosen to travel without revealing his identity, hoping to rediscover how ordinary people treated someone who appeared to possess nothing. During those travels, he had encountered suspicion, rejection, and indifference almost everywhere he went, except at Rowan's home. The lawyer carefully placed a folder onto the kitchen table. Everett had not been testing anyone for publicity or entertainment. His lost wallet had genuinely created unexpected complications. Yet he never forgot how a struggling father with almost nothing had willingly surrendered his only couch without expecting recognition, reward, or repayment. Inside the folder lay documents establishing a scholarship fund in Clara's name that would cover every educational expense through university. There was also confirmation that Hawthorne Industries had purchased Rowan's rental house from the owner and transferred full ownership into Rowan's name without debt or mortgage. Finally, there was an offer for Rowan to oversee community outreach and facilities development for the company's growing charitable foundation, a position that paid more than he had ever imagined earning. Rowan stared silently. He searched every page for hidden conditions. There were none. He asked why. The lawyer answered with quiet honesty. Everett believed that generosity should not simply be rewarded once. It should be multiplied until it transformed entire communities. News spread faster than anyone expected. Local reporters arrived after learning the remarkable story. Rowan declined interviews at first because he feared becoming the center of attention. Eventually he agreed to one conversation, but instead of discussing the gifts he had received, he spoke about loneliness, grief, and how easy it was to overlook people whose circumstances were invisible. His words reached millions. Letters poured into the foundation from families inspired to volunteer at shelters, foster children, donate furniture, or simply spend time with elderly neighbors living alone. Churches, schools, and community organizations launched kindness projects using Rowan's interview as encouragement rather than spectacle. Several months later, Rowan finally met Everett again during a charity event held on a bright autumn afternoon. The older man looked healthier, stronger, and happier than before. Neither rushed toward the other dramatically. They simply embraced like family reunited after a long journey. Everett admitted that he had expected only a place to rest. Instead, he had found something money could never purchase, proof that compassion still existed where hardship lived. Rowan admitted that opening the front door had frightened him. But he had realized that fear should not always make the final decision. Clara presented Everett with a framed drawing copied from one of the birds he had sketched weeks earlier. She had practiced every afternoon until she believed it looked almost as beautiful as his original. Everett became emotional. The drawing hung in his office beside awards worth millions. As years passed, Rowan transformed the foundation into one of the country's most respected community outreach organizations. Rather than writing checks alone, the foundation repaired homes for widows, created job training programs for struggling parents, funded libraries in underserved neighborhoods, and established emergency housing for families facing sudden hardship. Every project carried the same quiet philosophy: real change begins when someone decides another person's pain matters. Clara grew into a compassionate young woman who volunteered every weekend. She often told children at community centers that the biggest miracles rarely arrived wrapped in bright paper. Sometimes they arrived disguised as difficult choices that required courage before they revealed their blessings. Rowan never forgot the tiny couch that had started everything. although he could now afford luxurious furniture, he asked a craftsman to restore that old couch instead of replacing it. It remained in the entrance hall of the Foundation's headquarters as a reminder that extraordinary generosity often begins with ordinary sacrifice. Visitors frequently asked why such an old piece of furniture occupied the building's most visible space. Rowan simply smiled and explained that the most valuable seat in the world was once offered by someone who believed kindness should never depend on wealth. Before leaving today, take a quiet moment to think about this story's message. What small act of kindness has someone shown you that changed your life? Or what act of kindness do you hope to offer someone else? Holding on to those moments reminds us that compassion has the power to echo far beyond a single day. The greatest fortunes are not always measured by bank accounts, titles, or success. Sometimes they are measured by the doors we choose to open, the strangers we choose to trust with wisdom and care, and the hope we preserve for people who have almost forgotten it exists. Rowan Mercer never expected that giving away his only couch for one afternoon would change the course of his family's future. Yet the greatest gift was never the house, the career, or the financial security. It was discovering that genuine kindness is never wasted. Even when it seems unnoticed, it plants seeds that can one day grow into blessings far larger than anyone could ever imagine. And in a world that often rewards selfishness, one ordinary father proved that a generous heart can still inspire miracles that last for generations.